I played these preludes for years. The famous prelude in C major, the C minor, the D major, the E minor. Like most musicians, I always thought of them as 4 separate pieces. Then I came across an idea from the musicologist Joel Lester that made me listen to them rather differently. His suggestion is surprisingly simple. What if these pieces aren't really independent works at all? What if Bach intended them to show a gradual process of musical growth? A simple idea in the C major prelude, expanded in the C minor, developed further in the D major, and transformed by the time we reach the E minor. It's impossible to prove. But once I started looking at these pieces through that lens, I found it surprisingly difficult to hear them as completely separate works ever again. Let's begin with the prelude in C major. Most people hear a beautiful stream of arpeggios, but underneath the surface, something remarkably simple is happening. Bach begins, he moves away from home, he creates tension, and then he returns. Everything grows from one basic idea. Nothing is wasted, nothing is complicated. The piece is almost a demonstration of how much can be achieved with very limited material. It's as if Bach begins with the simplest possible example. Now listen to the prelude in C minor. At first it feels completely different. The mood is darker and more intense. Yet beneath the surface, the broad shape is surprisingly familiar. The same basic plan is still there. Only now Bach seems to be exploring it in greater detail. The texture is richer, the harmony travels further. It's as though the idea from the C major prelude has started to grow. Now here's the part that really caught my attention. These preludes didn't begin live on the Well-Tempered Clavier. Earlier versions already existed in Bach's notebook for his son Wilhelm Friedemann. When Bach prepared the Well-Tempered Clavier, he substantially revised them. Why return to these particular pieces? Why revise them so extensively? Lester suggests Bach may have been shaping them into a progressive sequence, one designed not simply to be played, but to teach. Whether Lester is right is impossible to prove, but the parallels between these 4 preludes are certainly striking. The D major prelude is where I start to hear the connection most clearly. The music suddenly feels much bigger. Bach seems to be thinking on a larger scale. Ideas return, patterns are extended, the structure becomes more ambitious. What began as a simple framework in the C major prelude is now supporting something much more substantial. For me, this feels less like a completely new piece and more like the next step in the same process. And finally, we arrive at the E minor prelude. For me, this is the most striking of the 4. Something new happens here. For the first time, a clear melodic line begins to emerge from the texture. The music feels more expressive and more individual. Yet underneath it all, many of the same principles remain. The original idea hasn't disappeared. It's simply developed into something richer. Of course, we can never know with certainty whether Bach intended these 4 preludes to function as a composition course. He never tells us so explicitly, but Bach was a teacher throughout his life. Many of his keyboard works were written for students, and these 4 pieces do seem to become steadily more sophisticated as they unfold, not by abandoning the original idea, but by developing it. Perhaps that's the real lesson. Great music doesn't always begin with a great idea. Sometimes it begins with a simple idea that is developed imaginatively. What I like about Lester's idea is that it changes the way we listen. Instead of hearing 4 separate preludes, we begin to hear connections between them. One piece seems to grow naturally out of the last. The C major prelude introduces a possibility. The next 3 show what Bach can do with it. And perhaps that's one reason musicians never seem to stop studying Bach. Not simply because the music is beautiful, but because it allows us to hear musical ideas being shaped and developed. We do know that Bach revised his pieces. We do know that he was a teacher. And we do know that from the simplicity of the C major prelude to the richness of the E minor, the music seems to grow before our ears. Perhaps that is exactly what Bach wanted his students to hear.